So welcome to the Jackman Humanities Institute working group on class struggle revisited, theory, method, and praxis. I'm Sharzad Mujab, faculty member and co-organizer of the lecture series with three brilliant doctoral students of mine, Genevieve Ricci, Shirin Haqqu, and Wasal Abu Qaddam. This is our second session, focusing on capitalist imperialism, colonization, racism, and patriarchy. And the assigned reading is Empire's Tracks, Indigenous Nations, Chinese Workers, and the Transcontinental Railroad by Manu Karuka. We are delighted to welcome Professor Karuka, who will talk about the book and will engage with us in discussing the key themes of this important book. We're also very happy to welcome my dear friend and colleague, Professor Michelle Murphy, who will facilitate this conversation. And there are the guidelines for our sort of the conversations is posted in the chat box, and as you can see it, please read it and refer to it in terms of how we are planning to sort of run this discussion and question and answer period. What we are doing is that we will be recording the presentation and conversation of Professor Karuka and Professor Murphy only, and then we will stop recording for the discussion and Q&A section of the conversation. As we are about to discuss the question of colonialism, imperialism, patriarchy, and racism, a First Nation land in Caledonia in southern Ontario is burning. It is an Indigenous land that it is being marked for quote-unquote development. And on the other side of the country, a weeks-long dispute between commercial fishermen and Mi'kmaq lobster harvesters in Nova Scotia is continuing. It is in this ongoing Canadian settler colonial order that we do the land acknowledgement today. The University of Toronto is on Indigenous land, which for thousands of years have been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, many of whom continue to fight against colonization, extractive industries, carceral estates, and gender sexual oppression. To understand contemporary class struggle and class structure, we must begin by acknowledging the historical colonial violence and exploitation that resulted in conquest and expropriation of Indigenous land to establish and consolidate capitalist imperialist social relations. We also acknowledge the ongoing legacies of patriarchal colonialism, capitalism, and imperialism that continue to displace and dispossess people. And in recent decades, we experience these relations in their fascist, political, and Indigenous form. Professor Karuka writes, imperialism as a mode of relationship is historical and ongoing in North America. He also writes, in this book that we are about to discuss, I argue that continental imperialism proceeds through the interrelationship of a state and corporation, and more specifically, through the war-finance nexus. As we discussed last session, that one practice that we want to have is close reading of the text. I'm going to also read a paragraph from page 198. He writes, Manu writes, we have seen in North America a tactical convergence in indigenous struggle and the Black-led urban struggles of the poor and working class. International finance capital maintains liquidity through flexible accumulation, which it achieves through control over infrastructures of logistics and circulation. In North America, timber, oil, coal, diamonds, and other resources are extracted from indigenous lands as core contemporary sites of accumulation by encroachment. Major highways and trail lines pass through indigenous territories, and the control over extraction and over infrastructures of circulation is at the heart of continental imperialism today. For decades, indigenous communities in North America have been deploying blockades at the strategic sites of extraction and distribution on their lands to assert their autonomy and self-determination from the settler states that surrounded them. Blockades have become central tactics to oppose the occupation and capitalization of indigenous places across the Americas. Since the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, urban infrastructures has also become a site of tactical blockades, whether key thoroughfares or tourist sites or airports and highways. These blockades potentially arrest the liquidity and hence the value of finance capital. So by just sharing some of these quotes, among many, many more from Manu's book, I just also introduce him to you, that he's an assistant professor of American Studies and affiliated faculty in Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Barnard College. And his work centers a critique of imperialism with a particular focus on anti-racism and indigenous decolonization. My very dear friend and colleague, Dr. Michelle Murphy, is a professor at the Women and Gender Studies Institute at the University of Toronto. Truly fantastic researcher and teacher, award-winning author, and many of her research projects also have been awarded. Her work focuses on feminist and decolonial science and technology, environmental and reproductive justice, indigenous feminism, and data and infrastructure studies. Some of you have already read her influential and an excellent chapter on reproduction in the book that I edited on Marxism and feminism. I welcome our guests and I welcome all of you and pass on so-called the microphone to Michelle to start the conversation.
Okay, I'm unmuted now. Thank you so much, Shahrzad. So lovely to see at least the boxes of people who are gathered here in this space together, and a special thank you to Manu for coming and joining with us and being in conversation with us in this kind of intellectual political work, which is which kind of you feel the need for every day. So Empire's Tracks is a book that I read last year for a course I taught called Terraformations. And in that class, it's actually a graduate course taught across 4 different universities simultaneously. And we were trying to take up the question of what happens when we start with land, when we want to be theorizing and understanding colonialism, capitalism, anti-Black racism, but also for me, infrastructure, technoscience, and so on. So we read Empire's Tracks, and it was a book that ended up really staying with me long after and is really influencing my own thinking. My work right now is mostly about a place in Ontario called Chemical Valley, which is on Anishinaabe territory. It's part of the Three Fires Confederacy area. And it's on the border between Canada and the US, on the river that connects Lake Huron into Lake Erie. And it's a place where 40% of Canada's petrochemicals are refined. So the question of the long, and not only that, this Chemical Valley started in 1850. So it started with the world's first commercial oil field. So this history of infrastructure, of ongoing and enduring projects of asserting Indigenous sovereignty against colonial infrastructural disruptions, and then the long work of solidarity that the book takes up really spoke to me and the whole class. And so I'm really glad we're here for this conversation. So the first kind of thing I wanted to invite you, Manu, to talk about is the concept of counter-sovereignty. That's one of the opening moves of the book, is to offer us counter-sovereignty as a description of the United States and we could say Canada as settler colonial projects or imperial projects, internally imperial projects. And I would like to, I want to read just so your definition, and then maybe invite you to say about who you're building on to develop the idea of counter-sovereignty and why it is so kind of such an important starting place for your analysis. So we get a definition of counter-sovereignty, a first definition in the preface. And Manu writes, counter-sovereignty, a position of reaction to distinct Indigenous protocols governing life in the spaces the United States claims as its national interior. Recognition of prior and ongoing Indigenous collective life provides a substructure to stabilize US property claims. The United States declares its existence in reaction to complex networks of relationship between humans and non-human life forms and inanimate processes that together constitute a distinct place in the world. Counter-sovereignty as a mode of political authority is closely linked to counterintelligence, counter-insurgency, and counter-revolution. Imagine these terms might resonate with a lot of people on this call. All modes of reactive anxiety, fragile modes of power that can take overwhelmingly violent form. So Manu, I would love to hear kind of who you're building on in your development of counter-sovereignty and why it was so important to start the book with that position and framework.
Great, thanks. Yeah, thanks for the question. And I'm so happy to be with you all. I'm really excited about just having an extended engagement with the book. It's a rare kind of and precious kind of thing. So I'm really excited about this. And I wish we all could be together in one place, but it is nice that we're able to still connect and find ways to connect. So thanks for the question, Michelle. I think, counter-sovereignty to me, I came from first as a student, just studying Indigenous studies and Indigenous politics, in which, of course, sovereignty is such an important frame and a debated framework. And the debate itself, I think, for decades has been really informative, very rich for the field and for the politics. And as a student learning this conversation, where there's such care to define what is sovereignty, what is the usefulness of sovereignty, generally speaking, to Indigenous frameworks and to specific Indigenous frameworks, where, of course, it's a term that is not in itself an Indigenous term. It comes out of different political traditions. It comes out of colonial political traditions. So how is this term useful? In what ways? What are the dangers of it? What are the pitfalls? What's the practical usefulness of this? So for me, turning to work like Joanne Barker's edited volume, Sovereignty Matters, or Audra Simpson's work on refusal, ethnographic refusal, and thinking about sovereignty in a scholarly method, in intellectual method. And Aileen Morton Robinson's work on the ways that the sovereignty of settler states, this possessiveness has to be constantly reproduced in a way that the colonizer, it happens in a way that the colonizer can be completely unaware of. And yet indigenous peoples constantly are reminded. She has some really powerful passages in her book. I can't remember the title, Minnesota book on possessiveness and
Like possessive.
the white possessive, thank you. I often forget titles when I need to remember them. Thanks. So, those are just three texts that come to mind. But of course, there's a much broader conversation. Von Deloria's work on sovereignty, political sovereignty and spiritual sovereignty, different dimensions of sovereignty, and the way that they interacted at different points in his own political and intellectual life. So reading this, for me as a student, I was asking, I was in a graduate program in American Studies. So I was asking all these things I'm learning about sovereignty, the term, the political lineage of the term, what it means, where it manifests, how it can be used. I was asking, well, where can we find any clear enunciation of what makes the United States sovereign? I'm studying the US, but I think this, as you said, Michelle, I think this is the case for North America more broadly. But what makes the US sovereign? What makes Canada sovereign? I think the conversation is slightly different, the way it works, the way it's worked out. But in the case of the United States, I haven't found any clear definition from Supreme Court jurisprudence, from the legislative record. I haven't found any clear enunciation of what makes the United States sovereign. And I think counter-sovereignty for me is partly something I landed at in this search and failure to find any clear definition. What makes this country sovereign, or this, what claims to be a country, a nation state sovereign? How does it define its sovereignty? How is its sovereignty defined in relation to other political, other polities outside of this continent or within this continent that it recognizes? So what's the precise nature of the sovereignty of the United States or of Canada? And, counter-sovereignty to me, I came to in thinking there's something relational about this that's not spoken. And it was wanting to get to this dimension that I think we can miss analytically if we have a discussion about indigenous sovereignty that's responding to and reacting to settler forms of sovereignty, whether here in North America or Australia or New Zealand or Hawaii, that the assumed sovereign is the colonial sovereign or the imperial sovereign. And I think that's actually backwards. I think counter-sovereignty, to me, is a term that can remind us that that actually is backwards. The sovereignty, let's say the United States, the first treaty that the US signed was with the Delaware Nation. So what makes the United States actually an entity that can claim to be involved in international relations is its relations with indigenous nations. And so it's relational, it's in relation, it's also reactive to those. And I want to suspend the term sovereignty. We can say sovereignty, or the claim to authority, the autonomy, the self-determination of indigenous nations that the US, that Canada, that Australia, that other settler polities come into relationship with. And so I think there's an analytic move. It's also a political move to remind ourselves that what claims to be the authority, what claims to be speaking from the position of originality, the originary position, is actually in reaction. It's always in reaction. And in the chapter, The Prose of Counter-Sovereignty, I extend that, and I think there's an anxiety about that reaction as well, and I think that's reflected in Supreme Court law. It's reflected in legislation. It's reflected culturally. It's reflected in the economy. It's reflected in the documents of the Indian Bureau. In all these ways, you can see this anxiety in settler memoirs. You can see this anxiety that's reflected. So, that's one way I got to it. I think there's a larger dimension of this too, when thinking about studies of imperialism and colonialism broadly in other parts of the world, and trying to get to some of the ways that maybe we can be specific about how colonialism and imperialism are manifesting in North America. And I think counter-sovereignty can help us understand some of that. So I also am engaging the work of subaltern studies. So the chapter, the Prose of Counter-Sovereignty, itself invokes and riffs off of the classic essay, The Prose of Counter-Insurgency by Ranajit Guha, which is a foundational essay for South Asian subaltern studies. Guha is analyzing the records that colonial officials left, where they were kind of charting insurgencies, anti-colonial insurgencies that would break out in different parts, peasant insurgencies in different parts of Southern Asia. And he's, I think for me, when I first read this as a sophomore in college, it's one of those light bulb moments where he charts out what could be read as a historical document that's just recording facts. It's an inaccurate reading of that document if we don't record the active policy or these documents themselves are reacting to the insurgencies, and they're trying to shape a policy to end the insurgency. So he calls it, the Prose of Counter-Insurgency. So what if you go to the archive, or if you're looking in the library and you read this document that's left, that was recorded by a colonial administrator in a village in the heat of a moment, and peasant uprising has started, and they're writing down, we believe this to be, this is broken out among Muslim tenants in this one area, and their concerns are about, maybe they've recorded religious concerns or concerns about taxation. And we believe these are the leaders. We believe this is how they're organized. And therefore we believe the way to end this, the correct policy to end this revolt is, it could be anything. It could be cultural concessions, religious concessions, changes to the tax policy. It could be mobilizing troops in specific places in specific ways. The document records all of these strategies. And when we record it, when we now look back at that document and just read it as giving us details about who was the leader of this insurgency, what was driving the insurgency, what were the aims of the insurgents, of the rebels, then we miss the actual work of the document. It's not telling us the truth. It's telling us about colonial policy. And so, I wanted to apply that lens to North America, to the archive that I was working with. And I saw very, very similar, things at play, but in a very different colonial situation, in a settler colonial situation. So for example, there are documents or census forms that were taken in the Indian Bureau of Paiute communities. And these census documents, which I've seen, break down different communities by gender and by age. And then there's a column that says propensity to work. And in each of these columns, there are numbers, but sometimes some of the columns are blank. Sometimes there's a question next to the number. Sometimes there's just a question mark in the column itself. So this document there's one particular document I'm thinking of that was invoked actually in congressional testimony by an anthropologist in the 1970s to argue that Paiutes should not receive federal recognition. And those documents were invoked as facts, as empirical facts, without completely ignoring all of this information about question marks and blank spaces. And so and even this propensity to work and trying to understand in context why they were recording both gender and propensity to work. You know, what was that about, and how was that actually being recorded and found out? And gender itself, how was that being recorded and found out? What was the meaning of these categories? So all of these are just reported back in the testimony as facts in a way that's used in the 1970s, almost a century after the document was created, in order to refuse recognition of these Paiute communities under the Federal Indian Bureau, under the system in the United States. And so that act of, in this case, what I'm arguing, counter-sovereignty, gets papered over into a document of sovereignty, into an action of claiming sovereignty, of reproducing that sovereignty. And again, in the 1970s, as it was in the 1880s, it's reactive to the people who are there, to their relationship with that place, to the authority of their relationship and their knowledge of that place. So counter-sovereignty, to me, I think is a term that is useful for me in thinking about, in approaching the archive. It's also it's a useful term of thinking about the constant reproduction of colonialism in the present day, and our role as scholars, as intellectuals, working with these archives, working historically or as critics or as ethnographers, or, you know, whatever method or genre of scholarship we're engaging in, our role as reproducing, that reactive relationship to the archive, to the community, to the land itself.
Thank you. That makes me think about, at the end of the book, there's kind of how I read it, the end. I experienced the end as about solidarity. And thinking about, the whole project being about, on the one hand, labor and migrant labor, and the other hand being like Indigenous, ongoing Indigenous presence and polities. And that putting these two relations to imperial capitalism together in a single frame, right? Which is a kind of historical move, but it's also a kind of, I felt like a kind of solidarity making move. And for me reading it, thinking about, we read it in a class in Toronto where we had both like Indigenous and many people who are like diasporically located in Toronto, bringing different anti-colonial or anti-racist or radical traditions kind of into the class, and that kind of ongoing question about how do we kind of work in some kind of solidarity while still acknowledging the specificities of the relations that make up our conditions, right? Our different conditions in imperial capitalism, let's say. That's kind of like the pedagogical struggle or the political struggle. On one hand, I also think about, just being Métis myself. I'm from Winnipeg, the Red River Winnipeg community. That's the community that like kind of led the Northwest Rebellion. And it's always been really interesting to me historically. It's like basically the same period you're writing about. There was incredible solidarities between the Métis uprising, and then between, let's say, like Cree Kin, but also between labor struggles in Chicago. And the kind of really radical like labor struggles that kind of gave rise to like the Haymarket uprisings, for example. And there's a kind of Métis radical tradition. We could look at someone like Howard Adams, right? Prison of Grass, kind of theorizing this, trying to kind of this ongoing work, like it goes back to the 19th century, right? This ongoing work of theorizing a critique of capital and a critique of settler colonialism in North America simultaneously. That's a kind of preamble to saying that it became really important, I think, in the text that you may have this kind of thing you repeat over and over, which is we must simultaneously understand the company and the state together. Right? We're going to look at this as a question of labor and land, right? Racial exclusion and colonial territorialization, we're also talking about a relation between the company and the state. And, you know, here in Canada, Canada in a way started as exactly the kind of charter company, right? As the Hudson's Bay, it kind of flips over, you know, through confederacy into a nation state. If we even go to the 17th century, like we can see those like charters flipping over into Massachusetts and these kind of like deep imbrications. So I would love to hear you say more about the importance of understanding the company and the state together. When you say counter sovereignty, we can begin by thinking, oh, that's about the state. But you know, reading the book carefully, you're also saying something about the company and the state together in relationship to this encounter sovereignty. So,
yeah, thanks. I love that. I think, yeah, you know, what you said, you know, I think I really, I love hearing that. And I take it as a challenge too. I think it's a collective challenge for all of us to do the work to have a better and clearer understanding of working class struggle. What we think of working class struggle in North America as it's tied to anti-colonialism and as it's tied to struggles for indigenous self-determination. For, you know, I think obvious reasons, our historical memories have separated these two as, you know, as very different, very distinct. But I think a clear understanding of imperialism actually can help us understand why that, you know, from the beginnings, these political traditions and theoretical traditions, these analyses of what exists and what is possible and what's necessary, all of these came through these kinds of solidarity, these forms of solidarity. So I think, you know, the relationship between the corporation and the state for me is something I came to through trying to be more and more precise about imperialism and what imperialism is, both in North America and elsewhere. I think we now, for a lot of different reasons, we could think about this. Maybe even could be a productive semester-long conversation about what do we mean by imperialism, and what are the very many different things that are meant by that term, and what are the implications of those different definitions. So today there's, you know, a huge variety of meanings of imperialism: cultural domination, political domination, or various forms of domination writ large. I'm trying to be, you know, really specific in understanding what imperialism is. There's a definition I quote in the book from the Indian historian Amiya Kumar Bakshi, who writes that imperialism is the persistent tendency of mature capitalist states to foment violent crisis, which I find to be a useful definition. So it leads us to think about capitalism and the state and war or conflict. So that's useful. I make a lot of deep work and engagement with Lenin and Du Bois as well, and their understandings of imperialism. Du Bois in Black Reconstruction, in his essay *The African Roots of War*, and of course Lenin in his pamphlet, in his book *Imperialism*. And one of the breakthroughs that Lenin provided in his analysis of imperialism is, it was an analytical breakthrough, but it was reflected politically as well, was the need precisely to connect working class struggle with national liberation, with self-determination and decolonization of oppressed nations. And this is something, you know, this was a principle that he worked out in the text and others are working out, and which was debated in the Third International. And I think in North America, if we think about that debate, it was read and discussed in North America at the time as well. And that's part of what I think we've forgotten today. If we go back and look what people were looking at, what connects working class struggle with struggles of oppressed nations here in North America? It's a move that Lenin didn't make in the book and in his analysis that I want to extend in studying the history of North America, to see that North America is a space of hundreds of colonized nations. And so that struggle, both of working class solidarity and then anti-colonial solidarity, and the bridge between the two, that's a struggle that actually integrally shapes class struggle, anti-imperialist struggle, anti-colonial struggle, or let's say even more broadly, anti-capitalism in North America. Yeah, I think so I guess the corporation and the state is a way to be precise about what is imperialism, how is it manifesting? And as you said, Michelle, I think, it's really interesting when we look here that the origins, the historical origins of these states and of territories, the historical origins lie in corporations, and not just corporations, but joint stock companies, like specific types of corporations that are about pooling resources and also lessening individual risk. And they lead to distinct kind of rationalities, distinct kind of relationships between investors. And they actually have legal, they institute legal precedent that continues to be invoked in property law, in real estate law. So the law of the land, literally, the law of dealing with the land, has its origins in these kind of rationalities and relations set in place by these companies. The companies themselves also, organized their own court systems. They organized their own militias and military and police forces. And so many of the things we associate with the state originated historically with these companies. And Joanne Barker's got a great essay, The Corporation and the Tribe, which I make use of and cite, engage in the book. And there's a book by a scholar, Adam Barkin, as well, about the relationship between the corporation and the state. He's not looking so much at indigenous histories, but in a broader sense, which I think is really, for me, really useful on this question. But we see the joint stock company as a point of origin, and also a point of origin for slavery as well. So not just colonialism, but for the rationalities and the relations of moving millions of Africans and selling them as property. Again, as real estate. So not only land, but slaves. Slaves as a property claim was a type of real estate property, which is something that Du Bois thought about and analyzed. And so again, yeah, it's this relationship between the corporation and the state. The corporation first informing the state, and then the state ceding powers to the corporation, the state taking revenue from the corporation, and then the state giving, in movements of territorialization, of grabbing new territory and occupying new territory. The state, cedes land, power, authority to corporations. In this case, I'm writing about railroad corporations, but it was the case also with mining corporations, with ranching companies, and eventually with some of the energy corporations, coal and oil. And so it's this relationship between the corporation and the state. And I think then to get back to solidarity, when we think about solidarity, how do we map solidarity? What are the terrains of solidarity? What do different groups bring that's distinct to, what are the common, let's say, the common enemies, the common points of struggle? What's distinct by communities that are situated, let's say, in the oil complex, communities that are situated in a place where fracking is taking place, compared to communities that are along the line of the pipeline where the oil is being transported, and then compared to the communities that are in the areas where the oil is being refined and stored before it's being shipped. And maybe even we could extend it to beyond the seas, to communities and ports and other places where the oil is then received. What connects these different communities, these different sets of politics, these different sets of relationship to the land, these different types of violence and violation that's being done to land and water? I think the attention to the corporation and to the state, the relationship between the two, the clear understanding of the distinction between the two can help us be specific about those solidarities without collapsing the distinctions, but actually to look at those distinctions in order to have a better, clearer map of what are the pressure points, what can be changed, where can the fight be taken, which is what, I think that's actually, again, this is historically for centuries, this is how that, how that struggle has been proceeding.
And it makes me think about when you almost came here before in March, at the beginning of March, at the beginning of COVID, here we were having a really important period of solidarity actions across pipeline, railroad, and petrochemicals, doing kind of cross-nation blockades, right, in solidarity with Wet'suwet'en at the time. And so that kind of long history, like your book kind of in a way gives us part of that long history of this as an ongoing tactic, and why these infrastructures are continually these places where solidarities and pressure points kind of manifest for themselves. So thank you for that. So Shahrazad opened with a quote that talked about war and finance, which is maybe like a different iteration of, right, the company and the state, or the state and the company, I guess, war being the state and kind of finance being the company, kind of, but they're going across. And another kind of thing that just stayed with me and continues to stay with me about your book was offering us the concept of shareholder whiteness. And a couple of things about that. One, that we can, I think, have an analytic temptation to see financialization as a recent phenomenon in the history of capitalism, rather than, like you're saying, joint stock venture as being like what kicked off kind of global imperialism, right? So that this kind of financialization is actually so incredibly deep inside of these forms. So I wanted to maybe pull out a quote about joint stocks and chartered companies that you offered us. That helps us maybe think about shareholder whiteness, and then maybe you could say more about kind of what you're doing with that and why that was kind of an intervention into the way that whiteness is theorized as a formation in the United States. So on page 151, Manu writes, in North America, the corporate share remains a core vehicle of continental imperialism. Joint stock or chartered companies founded European colonies, mobilizing resources drawn from multiple investors, raising capital while leavening individual exposure to risk. Pooling risks for colonialism and slavery led to the development of very particular rationalities, empirical knowledge about the strategic immiseration of human life in the interest of maximizing returns on investment. In the United States, impulses of regulation and control lurk behind a thin veil of radical democracy, the succession of imperial sovereignty from crown to the people, citizens as shareholders of a colonial corporation. The sovereignty of the colonial state in the form of legal exemptions for the discipline of individuals and populations displays a fundamentally corporate nature. And then a little bit later on 153, you kind of talk a little bit again about the citizen shareholder is the agent and beneficiary of the war finance nexus. And so I'd love to hear you talk more. I think shareholder whiteness is a really powerful analytic that has helped me a lot, and I'd love to hear you say more about that.
Thanks. I have some anxiety about shareholder whiteness, about the concept, and the anxiety is where I begin in that chapter. That I think it's been alarming for me to see in the past few years. Maybe it's been the case for a longer time, but in anti-racist movements, ways that we have rebiologized race, and I think we can see this most clearly in the ways that we talk about whiteness. and white privilege. And it's not just in the classroom, it's not just in scholarship, it's in struggles as well. And I think that's really dangerous. And so the idea of shareholder whiteness for me is precisely a way to get the idea of whiteness away from biology. So I think there is, I agree that financialization is a process that has very, very deep historical roots. And again, I think it's, if we want to have a clear understanding of the long history of imperialism, part of what we need to do is have a better understanding of the history of financialization, the deep and long history of financialization, and the ways that it shaped the formation of the identities and the struggles of colonized peoples, but also the ways that it shaped the identities and the rationalities of colonizers. And so, that quote where I wrote about strategic immiseration of human life, for example, one of the lessons I learned, I took from there was from Stephanie Smallwood's book, Saltwater Slavery, where she writes about, it's incredible analysis. And it's devastating to teach, devastating to read about on slave ships in the Middle Passage, how, it was a calculated rationality. How little food, how little water could be given to the captives. How many captives could, the captain and the people investing in the slave ship had a rationality. How many people would they buy? How many captives would they buy? And how many could they allow to die, on the passage and still make a profit? She writes about the manacles, the types of tools that they would use to torture people, and the experimentation they had about the sources, how much to spend on these things. So it's, when we think about rational investments, everything is broken down in these deep histories in this way. So shareholder whiteness also, I think, in the United States, it tracks to a specific historical moment. After emancipation, where, one of the ways I think we can think of whiteness, and it's not biological again, but before emancipation, whiteness meant that in the United States, you could buy and sell other people. That's something you could do if you were understood to be white. It's not, of course, that most people who are white couldn't do that. They couldn't afford to do that. But, it was a social and legal privilege or possibility that they had. After emancipation, of course, that changes. So what happens to that right to own people? What happens to it after emancipation? I think shareholder whiteness for me is one way to try to think through what happens to that right. That it becomes dispersed in a way, not the direct ownership of other people and the profit and the rationality entailed with that, but a much more indirect way that still bears these dividends. And in his essay, The African Roots of War, in which Du Bois, it's like a Jeopardy question, the African Roots of War. What's the question? The question that Du Bois was asking is, what caused the First World War? And he says, what caused the First World War was the scramble for Africa. And he has this phrase in that essay, the dividends of whiteness. He wrote this, a couple of decades before the Black Reconstruction, in which he wrote about the wages of whiteness. So to me, it's really interesting. Between those decades, the dividends of whiteness and the wages of whiteness. What's the distinction? Dividends is something you receive as a return on your investment. Wages, of course, is something you get for your labor, right? So what is that dividends of whiteness telling us? What is it tipping us to understand if we're thinking about war and imperialism? So I think Du Bois is, reading Du Bois, thinking about Du Bois, that essay a lot, got me to thinking about dividends and returns. What are these returns? Who's collecting these returns, and what precisely do these returns look like? And so, I think in the chapter Shareholder Whiteness, I trace out, okay, there's emancipation, there's the promise of Reconstruction, and there's the attack on Reconstruction. And the attack on Reconstruction isn't just the enshrinement of legal apartheid in the United States, but at the same time, it's the rise of the corporation, and not just the corporation, but the trust, a specific form of corporation. And not just the trust, but the trust that can claim the legal rights of a person in US law and US jurisprudence. So the very same constitutional amendment that was passed through, incredible struggle, through a civil war, in order to enshrine the personhood of Black people in the United States, overturned the Dred Scott decision. That's the very same amendment that's used in the period, as historical period, when legal apartheid is enshrined, is used to empower corporations as people in the eyes of the law, which is still the case. That's still how law works in the United States today. And so shareholder whiteness to me is a concept to get us to think about, well, what are the dividends coming to whiteness? What are the dividends coming to racist violence, to racial exploitation in these societies today? Who collects those dividends? Again, I don't think it's people, if we're thinking biologically. I think who collects those dividends today is much broader than what we would think of as white people. In New York, there's a conversation now about diversifying the boards of trustees of different organizations, museums, and different cultural organizations. So I think that, to me, when I see this conversation happening now, it raises these questions about who's collecting, what are these dividends, and who's collecting these dividends. And I also, in this chapter, it's interesting to me that Marx, in the third volume of Capital, when he's writing about finance capital, he describes finance capital as fictive capital. So industrial capital is the production and circulation and sale of goods, of tangible goods, or maybe we could say also services. But finance is claims on goods, claims on land. And so those claims, right, those shares can be bought and sold. There can be securities, layers and layers of securities that are sold on the shares or on a loan, or whatever it might be. So finance capital is fictive. The way I understand it is finance capital is fictive because it's a claim on capital. It's not the actual thing. It's a claim on the thing. And the claim on the thing, there can be exponential claims that are then made to the claims. You can buy and sell, you can bundle all these claims that people have and sell those. And you can do that at many different levels of order. So the subprime mortgage crisis in 2008 was that, that was a run on fictive capital. It was a crash of fictive capital. So, I think there's something to signal to living in such a highly financialized economy, or something to signal to the nature of imperialism today, which is about international, finance capital flowing freely throughout the world, and the violence that's necessary in order to ensure that free flow. That is tied to these questions of dividends, to shareholders, and then to this question of whiteness, which again is not European descent or white skin or anything that we could read biologically. It's a social relation. So and whiteness studies, of course, talks about how whiteness itself changes over time. And so I think, in my mind, there's no contradiction between that historical mapping of whiteness as a formation and the idea of shareholder whiteness.
Mm-hmm. And the other kind of reverberation it had for me was thinking it together with your analysis on counter-sovereignty and the kind of fragility of counter-sovereignty. And so thinking about the fragility of shareholder whiteness in a way, in that, the dividend is, can function effectively as you get a promise of one share for which the rate of return may never arrive. And so this is like a kind of another way of talking about the, on the one hand, the ruse of And then on the one hand, the ruse, and then on the other side, maybe a way of talking about some of the fragility, because the promise does not arrive. And so I wondered if that was also part of thinking about shareholder whiteness, and that's the other dimension to fictive capital, is not just that it's like bundling the claims, et cetera, but there's a kind of ruse built into it in the same way we can talk about the ruse of the claim of sovereignty of the settler state.
Yeah, absolutely. It's absolutely in these ways that you said, in my mind, connected to counter-sovereignty and to this idea of reactive anxiety. I mean, to me, that's one way of understanding the intense violence of whiteness, you know, as it manifests. In the US now, there's all this conversation about, you know, the support of men across the board for Trump right now, or the susceptibility of men across the United States to far-right politics. And to me, that's connected to this fragility, this anxiety, and you know, that violence is connected. And you know, it's also connected to the idea of security. So securities, in my mind, are connected to security. What ensures the return on investment? It's the mobilization of the military. It's the police forces that ensure that those property rights will be upheld, you know, in very brute material fashion. So yeah, I think it's to get to the mutable nature of whiteness, the fragile and reactive nature of whiteness, and also then to bring back to the idea of solidarity. This isn't new, of course, but you know, in the process of solidarity, one of the costs, and it's a cost which is well paid to society. One of the costs of solidarity is to, you know, weaken and lessen the concept of whiteness itself in the process of actually building, and I don't mean in theory, I mean actually in practice, in relationships, to weaken and dissipate, you know, the relations, the concept, the mentality of whiteness itself.
Well, thank you, Manu. I think that I've now taken up or now we've kind of had our 50 minutes of conversation, and I think it could go on and on, but I'm sure other people have things they want to ask you. So maybe I'll pass it over to.
I can take over.
Wonderful, thank you. But thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Go on and on talking to you.
I'd love that, but maybe some other time.